History was not kind to Africa, not because Africa lacked history, but because the world chose to forget it. A silence too loud. They said Africa was a dark continent, void of civilization, waiting to be discovered. It was a myth so loud that even centuries later, its echo remains in classrooms, museums, and minds. They taught us to look to Europe for civilization, to Athens for wisdom, to Rome for law. They taught us that our ancestors lived in mud huts, worshipped idols, and waited for salvation to come by boat. But this was never truth. It was strategy. To justify conquest, they had to erase what came before. Answer: they told the lie that Africa had no past. 2. The myth of emptiness. The maps of old Europe often showed Africa as a vague mass, unmarked, unnamed, unknown. This wasn't ignorance. It was design. By presenting Africa as void, colonizers could claim divine or civilizing right to occupy it. Lands were stolen, histories deleted, identities distorted, because who would defend a place declared empty? But Africa was never empty. It was overflowing, with empires, trade routes, architecture, language, cosmology, and law. 3. Fractured mirrors. The colonizers broke the mirror through which Africa saw itself. And in its place, they held up a glass that distorted everything. African gods became idols. African names were shortened or erased. African knowledge systems were called primitive. African governance became tribalism. This was not just conquest of land, it was the colonization of perception. IV. The stolen timeline. In European textbooks, Africa appeared only when Europe arrived. Egypt divorced from the continent, rebranded as Mediterranean. Ghana and Mali empires reduced to footnotes. The Bantu migrations, the Swahili coast, the Great Zimbabwe, all dimmed to trivia. Africa was cast as a continent waiting for outsiders to give it meaning. Versus institutions of erasure. The suppression of African history was not an accident. It was policy. It was theology. It was ideology. Colonial administrations withdrew borders, renamed cities, and punished the use of indigenous languages. Missionaries discouraged traditional belief systems, labeling them superstitions, and replaced them with foreign faiths and often painted African cosmologies as inferior. Educational systems imported wholesale from Europe, taught African children about British monarchs and European explorers while skipping over the civilization that flourished in Timbuktu, Axum, Mapungubwe, Benin and others. Echoes in the classroom. Even today, many African students grow up knowing more about Newton than Imhotep, more about Napoleon than Queen Nzinga, more about world wars than African resistance. The lie was never just told. It was taught. But each generation that asks what came before becomes a threat to that lie, and a guardian of the truth. Vi. Rewriting the first line. This chapter is the first strike against amnesia. Because before chains, before conquest, before borders were drawn with rulers and rifles, Africa lived, loved, built, governed, healed, dreamed. Africa is not rising. Africa is remembering.